Tonight we welcome author Tom Stanton to tell us the riveting, intersecting tales of the frightening rise and fall of the Black Legion and the magnificent athletic ascension of Detroit during the 1930s. Tom will have copies of his book, Terror in the City of Champions, for sale today by cash or check. Please give a warm RHPL welcome to Tom Stanton.
Well, I can only hope that you want to watch it again on TV once we're done here, but thank you very much for that welcome, especially on a rainy night like tonight, my goodness. This is my 7th book. It's nonfiction, and like all of my books, it takes root in my childhood. I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit. I was the son of a man who was one of 10 children born to a Polish Catholic family on the east side of Detroit near City Airport. And at the holiday times, all my uncles and aunts would come to our house, into the basement of our ranch home, with the twinkling lights on the walls and the smell of kielbasa and kraut and wafta and lasagna wafting on the air, and reminisce. And they would reminisce about primarily the 1930s. And it was a glorious time in my uncles' recollections. They were all sports fans. And I used to be so envious because I was this little boy who was sports obsessed in 1970, 71. I lived and died for the games. And if you are old enough to remember that period, this was after the Tigers had won the '68 World Series. Gordie Howe was near the end of his career with the Red Wings. The Pistons were mediocre, and the Lions were the Lions, right? And here were my uncles talking about this 8-month period in which the Tigers won their first World Series in October of '35. A month later, the Lions won their first NFL title ever. The following spring, the Red Wings won their first Stanley Cup, all as Joe Louis was undefeated and on the rise, and by the end of our tale in this book, filling Yankee Stadium with fans. And I just used to be so jealous. It just seemed like such a glorious time to be alive. But then there was this one darker story that my elderly uncle, the patriarch of the family, Clements Maximilian Stone, he's our most dramatic of my uncles. And he's shown here on the right when he was an aspiring writer in New York City trying to make it. It didn't happen. He invested his hopes in me instead. Though I have to tell you, he didn't view journalism as real writing, so I'm not sure I lived up to it. But that's him on the left as I knew him when I was a kid. And he had this darker story that he would tell at Christmas time. Inevitably, all these stories would be repeated. It was probably the same in your household. And this one story was he was walking in the Black Entertainment District of Detroit, 1936, with his brother, my Uncle Bucky, a boxer, and 2 of their friends. So this is your first shot at a Baby Ruth candy bar. You probably know the story of the Baby Ruth candy bar, but I'm going to tell it briefly anyways. There are no Ty Cobb candy bars, so that's why we have a Baby Ruth candy bar here. But this candy bar premiered, the name was changed in 1920 when Babe Ruth started bashing home runs for the New York Yankees and just changing the nature of baseball. And so the candy company changed the candy bar's name to Baby Ruth. Babe Ruth tried to get a bit of the action. Candy company said, no, we didn't name it for you. Babe Ruth tried to start his own Babe Ruth candy bar. They successfully in court prevented him from starting his own Babe Ruth candy bar. They argued in court, and I don't think they'd get away with it today, that we actually named this candy bar for Baby Ruth, the daughter of President Cleveland, who had died 18 years earlier. And so the point being here, in a very roundabout way, raise your hand if you know the name of the Black Entertainment District in Detroit. This is your first shot, right there. Paradise Valley. Normally I try to throw these candy bars. There are a lot of people around here, and my aim isn't that good, So yes, Paradise Valley, my uncles, their buddies, they're all progressive, radicals, artsy folks, walking along Hastings Street in Paradise Valley. This car pulls up beside them, 2 white guys in there, and they start questioning, what are you doing here? You're up to no good. You don't belong in this neighborhood. Go back to your own area. And my boxing uncle takes offense, and the situation grows. into a confrontation. By this point, the men in the car, an unmarked car, have identified themselves as Detroit police officers, and they've pulled weapons, and my uncles end up in the back of their unmarked patrol car. And in my uncle's retelling, it was, I thought this was the beginning of the end. I thought we were going to wind up dead. I thought this was the infamous Black Legion. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of the Black Legion. But if you do any research in mid-1930s Detroit, if you ever spent much time, as authors tend to do, in microfilm, microfiche, reading old newspaper front pages, the Black Legion was all over the place. And the way you became a Black Legion member, and these are outfits that are modeled by a couple Detroit police officers, was that if a friend of yours invited you to a party, a card party, a political gathering, a barbecue, a massing of good Americans, you might go, and at some point, if it were indoor, some point in the evening, and of course to get the invitation you had to be a white Protestant male. At some point in the evening, the lights would go out, and a red light might appear, or a red torch outside, and you would see that you were surrounded by guys dressed in outfits like this. And you would be told that at this point, you had heard too much here this evening not to become a member of the Black Legion. And you would take the black oath, as they called it, with a gun pointed at your head or your heart, or a noose around your neck. And you would be warned that the only former Black Legion members were 6 feet under, and that if you were to violate the code of secrecy, you would meet a similar fate. And as a reminder of that, you were, as your final bit of the initiation, you were tossed a cartridge and told that an identical one would be implanted in you if you ever broke ways with the Legion. You would be ordered to do the deeds of the Black Legion if necessary. You agreed that you would lie in court and to police officers if necessary, and that you would take orders unquestionably. Now, I like to think most of us in this room, if we got caught in that situation, you're in a room full of people with guns threatening you, telling you that should you ever break your vow of silence, that your head will be split, your guts will be spilt, and your days will come to an end, that we would find a way to get out of there, do what we need to, say what we have to escape that evening, and then just never go to a meeting after that. And there were men who tried to do that, and they would find a few weeks later there'd be a group of guys who would show up at their house encouraging them to come to meetings again. They'd be dressed in street clothes, not like this. And if you still didn't come, you might find yourself pulled off the streets one night, taken out to a field, stripped from the waist up, and one of 12, 13 guys taking a swing at your back with a black snake whip. It was estimated by the Michigan State Police captain, who I view as the most honest of the people who investigated the case, that the Legion killed about 50 people in southeast Michigan, many of them faked to look like suicides. It was estimated that the Legion had about 100,000 members in the tri-state area of Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, and they were kind of like a Ku Klux Klan, but more violent than the Klan. And I say most of us probably would have just tried to escape and just do what we did to prevent harm from coming to us. But there were other folks who agreed with the mission of the Legion, and this is one of the main characters of the book. And the book is all nonfiction. It's based on FBI files, Michigan State Police files, court documents, as well as some of the reporting from that era. This is Dayton Dean. Any of you been to Fort Wayne in Detroit? You know where Fort Wayne is? Down the street, the Mistursky power plant still operates. Well, that's where Dayton worked, and his day-to-day life was very mundane. He wrapped asbestos on pipes. And so when he's out there in the field in Romeo taking his oath, he's thinking, this is actually pretty cool. He's loving it. It's like an adventure. It's like a movie. It's like a radio serial. and it's so much more exciting than his day-to-day life. And he jumps into it wholeheartedly. He becomes a member of 2 of the 13 regiments that operated in the greater Detroit area. And he rises quickly enough so that he gets appointed to the death squad and gets assigned to attempt the assassinations of several people. If we can back up just a second, because the Legion is prospering in the 1930s, but you have to recall that in the 1920s, Detroit was a city that was just flourishing. Most of the big skyscrapers we think fondly of were built in the 20s. The Penobscot, the Guardian, the Fisher Building, the Masonic Temple, Olympia, which is now gone, of course, the DIA as we know it, the main branch of the library where it is today, all built in the 1920s. Money was flowing into the city. Population was growing so rapidly that Detroit became the 4th largest city in the country, behind New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And the makeup of the city was changing too, as people were continuing to come from overseas for automobile jobs, but also from down south and from other states. And it was in this environment, in this booming market, booming period until the market crashed in '29, that Detroit was just the place to be. By 1933, the heart of the Great Depression, unemployment, however, in the city was in the range of 40 to 45%. This is Frank Navin, who owned the Detroit Tigers at the time. Walter Briggs was his silent owner. Navin was a gambler by nature. He liked to raise horses and bet on them. He was a card player, but he was a penny pincher with his team. And if you're a sports fan, are many of you sports fans? Am I talking? Okay, a lot of you sports fans. So we like to think, those of us who romanticize our teams like to think that when we're down, our teams can lift our spirits. But if you were looking for the 1933 Tigers to lift your spirits, it wasn't happening, because they were a poorly playing team that year. And consequently, because of that and because of the Depression, attendance plummeted at Navin Field. It was a third of what it had been just 9 years prior. And so Frank Navin was hurting, and he needed to find some way to change the dynamics. And so he tried to hire Babe Ruth as the manager of the team. That didn't work out. Instead, he ended up with the best catcher in baseball, the guy in the upper right-hand corner. Anybody want to raise their hand if they knew who that is? So many hands there being raised. I'm going to try to throw this one. Let's see how we get. I'll try to catch it. All right, there we go. I had a clear path there, relatively, right? So Mickey Cochrane is one of if you were a little kid who loved baseball at this era, you knew who Mickey Cochrane was. He was one of the great ball players of his time. And he was also one of the most intense human beings on the field. Ty Cobb once described him, mild, meager Ty Cobb, as the most competitive man in the game. And you hesitate to psychoanalyze somebody 80 years on, but if we had known about bipolar personality, I think that would have been him. He was so intense. After a loss, he might lock himself away in a hotel room for a day or two. But he could also be the kind of guy who could inspire young athletes. And so when he comes into spring training in 1934, he starts to tell these young ball players, because after all, he is Mickey Cochrane, and he's won the World Series with Connie Mack's Philadelphia A's, that you guys have the talent to go all the way. And some of these younger guys bought into it. Some of the older guys who had been on the team last year kind of rolled their eyes at it. But nonetheless, this team in 1934 plays spectacularly, and fans start jamming Navin Field. And it was a team that, other than the fact that there were no blacks on the team, baseball wasn't integrated in the 30s, it was a team that reflected the mixture of people who lived in Detroit. You had a guy like on your far left, pitcher Tommy Bridges, who came from an affluent background. His father was a surgeon. He had an education. You had a guy like G. Walker, who was a Southern boy, down-home Southern boy, who who didn't have the same kind of education and hung out with other Southern boys and had some viewpoints that probably weren't too far from where the Black Legion fell on issues. And then it was said of G. Walker that if you put him on one side of the room and you put the rest of the Tigers on the other, it'd be about equal in volume in terms of their loudness. And then you had this guy, a backup utility guy, Flea Clifton, whose father died in World War I, whose mother was murdered, and he raised himself on the streets of Kentucky, Cincinnati, living behind people's garages. And so the whole city in 1934 is falling in love with the Detroit Tigers, including the guys who are in the Black Legion. So much so that they've actually planned some of their crimes around the Tigers' schedule. If we're going to take that guy out and beat him, let's wait till 5 o'clock when the game's done. So why would it be so unusual for a team or for a group like the Legion? It has the usual clan biases, anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-Black, to be rooting for the Detroit Tigers. One of the reasons is at first base. And so I already know that this is dangerous with you guys because so many of you are yelling out the answers that I should just be throwing the candy bars out there. But so we had at first base, anybody recognize this guy? Okay, I don't know where. I heard it over there, I heard it over here. So Hank Greenberg was quickly becoming the most popular Jewish athlete in America. We still had the boxer Max Baer, who was around and was also very popular. But he's a young, in his early 20s, a power-hitting first baseman. And he's outwardly Jewish, publicly Jewish. It was well known that Hank Greenberg was Jewish. Often headlines referencing it. So you had Hank Greenberg at first base, and then at second base you had a man that my father idolized, and I heard a lot about growing up, who I like to describe as probably at that time the third most famous Catholic in Detroit. You had Bishop Gallagher, would have been in the top 3. The most famous would be this guy, who was broadcasting out of Royal Oak, Michigan. Y'all got it. I just don't know where to send the candy bar. Father Coughlin, whose radio audience on Sundays is in the area of 10, 20, 30 million people, listeners. And he's been on the air for a while, so much so that huge crucifixion tower, 12 Mile and Woodward, is built with the money that has been flooding into him. He is receiving more mail than anybody in the country, including the president. So much so that they had to build the Royal Oak Post Office there for that purpose, to handle the mail. He has a staff of more than 100 handling his mail. And in 1934, 35, he is not yet the raging anti-Semite that he's going to become. You're seeing glimmers of that, but he's not quite to that stage. He is getting very political. Most famous Catholic. Number 3 is the guy who played second base for the Tigers. And if you were like my dad, who wanted to play professional baseball, didn't really have that caliber of talent, but had a mother who didn't want him to play professional baseball, a very Catholic mother, you could point to Charlie Gehringer and say, but Charlie plays, and he goes to church every day, and he's never going to get married while his mother's alive, and the whole tale of good old Charlie Gehringer. And so we see Charlie Gehringer here, Greenberg, Gehringer, and we traded before the season. Cochrane traded for this star outfielder from Washington who also had World Series experience. His name is Goose Goslin. All of these guys are going to end up in the Hall of Fame someday. Greenberg, Gehringer, Goslin. What do we notice about their last names? Geez, these are the G-men. All right? And they're the G-men at the time when every kid wants to be a G-man, because the federal agents have brought down John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson and Bonnie and Clyde, and they're going after Capone. And this is the head G-man, J. Edgar Hoover, with Mickey Cochrane in the basement shooting range of the FBI headquarters in D.C. Hoover became a fan of the Tigers because of that G-man connection that season. And I've been told, or at least from what I've read about Hoover, that he wasn't actually a very good shot, but he was good at posing with the camera. And Cochrane was actually a very good shot. Most people assume that Mickey Cochrane, because he has that nickname Mickey, that he's a Irish Catholic, but he's not. His first name was Gordon. His family called him Gordon. Friends called him Mike. He was a Protestant Irish 33rd degree Mason and very involved in the Masonic temple here. So, among the fans, we see Henry Ford, right? Yep. And we see his son Edsel. Anybody recognize this guy, the most famous comic of the era? Or one of them, anyways? Will Rogers. Yeah, I don't know where that came from. It's somewhere I know you had it too. So, Will Rogers. But does anybody recognize the guy on the right? Who said that? He's a law enforcement. So, usually people don't recognize Harry Bennett. But back in his day, Harry Bennett was a very well-known figure. And Harry Bennett described himself as closer to Henry Ford than Henry's own son, Edsel. He was the guy who fulfilled Henry Ford's darker dreams and darker passions. Now, depending on your viewpoint, he might be heroic, depending on where you were politically. In my uncle's pro-union viewpoint, he wasn't heroic. He was the archenemy. Harry Bennett was fast becoming good friends with Mickey Cochrane. He liked to surround himself with athletes. The coach of the Wolverines at Michigan, the coach of the Detroit Titans, former football players, they all hung around with Harry and spent time on his yacht. Out in the Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor area along the Huron River, near Getty's Road, Henry Ford had a mini mansion built for Harry Bennett because this was, Harry Bennett had two primary jobs with Henry Ford. The first was to keep his grandchildren safe, keep them from abduction. He was hired in the 1920s, former boxer, and that was, of course, the Lindbergh baby, kidnapping, and others. And the other was to keep the unions out of Ford. And of course, this is a rough and tumble world on both sides, not just on the corporate side, but also on the union side. And so Harry Bennett had been the target of death threats. And so the house that was built has a couple of gun turrets. It had cages for Harry's pet lions and tigers. It had escape tunnels that would lead to the river. I talked to Mickey Cochrane's last surviving child, and she said, we used to call him Uncle Harry, because they had, later on in the 40s, they had houses right next to each other on Grosse Ile. They were close. The house, one of the most unusual features of the house, I think, was the fact that they had this stone staircase inside in a windowless room, where if somebody was chasing you in the dark and didn't know how the staircase had been designed, it could make for a brutal fall, because the steps were not symmetrical. Some were uneven, some were 6 inches, 12 inches, 8 inches, slanted, to deter those in pursuit. There were folks who believed that Harry Bennett was the guy pulling the strings, one of the guys pulling the strings behind the Black Legion. However, if you went to musters, gatherings where 1,000 or 2,000 Black Legionnaires would come and spend the night and hear speeches all day and practice shooting and drink and just have a good time. This is the guy who, in your eyes, was the leader. He's an electrician out of Lima, Ohio. His name is Bert Effinger, and he liked to tell the members gathered that the Legion stands for only one ism, and that's Americanism. We're against Negroism, Catholicism, Judaism, progressivism, socialism, unionism. Americanism is what we're about. He also liked to tell them, and this was made up, that we had membership of 3 million or 5 million. Kept boosting the numbers because the organization had to grow. If you were a member, you had to bring people into the membership. And if you were one of those people who were reluctant of being a member, the thing that might deter you from telling anybody else about it is that when you would go to these gatherings, you would see people you knew. You would hear public officials speaking. you would see police officers there who'd also been tricked into joining in many cases. But one of the things I reveal in the book is that the police commissioner of Detroit was a member. This is not to say that he knew of the murders taking place in his name, but Heinrich Pickert was a card-carrying member of the Legions. So was the Wayne County prosecutor, Duncan Drunken McCree. The hat, along with the uniform, there's one at the Detroit Historic Museum, and there's also one at the Reuther Library across the street. The FBI knew about the Black Legion, but J. Edgar Hoover had very little interest in investigating. I went through 900 plus pages of documents. Even when some of his agents were making the case that bodies had been taken across state and in a couple of cases even international lines, he was still not interested. And so there's no record as to why that is, other than, he was continuously saying, not our jurisdiction, but then when it became obvious that there might be a jurisdiction issue, he really slammed down hard on the agents who had been investigating it. And the best I can figure out is one of two things. Either he was aligned politically with what the Legion believed, or if you went after the Black Legion in the northern states, which was controlled mostly by Republicans, you probably should be going after the Klan in the southern states, which has heavy Democratic affiliations. And then he's trying to build his organization. He's going to get it from both sides, senators on both sides. So one of the guys who was targeted for assassination was the guy in the upper right-hand corner. His name is Maurice Sugar. He was a radical attorney who often represented African Americans in their cases, criminal cases with the Detroit police when he felt they were being unjustly accused. This gentleman in the lower right-hand corner, if any of you read Kevin Boyle's book, Arc of Justice, about Ozzie and Sweet, that's Ozzie and Sweet, who was represented by Clarence Darrow, but Maurice Sugar was of counsel. He was part of that group. And later he would become, for a short while, the attorney for the UAW. He was one of the guys that Dayton Dean was assigned to kill. So was the publisher of the Highland Parker newspaper. So was the mayor of Ecorse. And probably other people that we did not learn about. These were two of the meeting places, though really you could meet anywhere. We're in Rochester Hills. I was talking with somebody who was from Lake Orion. There used to be musters out in Lake Orion. I don't remember specifically Rochester Hills, but all throughout Oakland County. These two facilities are in Detroit. The first was the Little Stone Chapel, which was along Cass Park, just down the street from the Masonic Temple in Detroit. And the other one still stands on the in southwest Detroit, near Waterman and Lafayette. It was called the Finletter Temple. Now it's a place you can rent to have graduation parties and things like that, if you care to. And I put them up here because two crimes that I want to focus on were hatched there. And this guy was a guy named William Guthrie, and he was initiated at the Little Stone Chapel. They put a noose around his head, and he reluctantly became a member and then started to embrace what they stood for until the local leader of his regiment happened to come to his house. And this guy's name went by the nickname Doc. He wasn't actually a doctor, but he did massages in his basement. As people called him Doc. The basement was very humid, and it was when his colonel visited, he determined this was the ideal place to breed typhoid germs. And so that was one of the early plots, was to try to breed typhoid germs. Guthrie wanted no part of this, but the leader was very persistent, and he found a milk inspector from Detroit at a dairy event in Grand Rapids, and he tried to convince him, was asking him about injecting typhoid. What would happen if we inject typhoid germs into cheese and milk deliveries to the black and the Jewish neighborhoods? And the guy tried to convince him, well, if you did that, you're not going to control it. I mean, it's going to spread like wildfire. But To give you a sense of the kind of stuff that the Legion was involved in, you might have grandiose plans like that, plans to take over the government. There was often mention of a password or a secret code word, Sixto, some places, or Lexto. And when you heard that, and you heard a town name, you were to head that direction with your weapons, because that was the moment where it was going to happen, where we were going to overthrow the government. And that was supposed to take place on September 16th, 1936. But they bombed buildings, they torched camps, they murdered people. But they also had pettier things on their mind. And Guthrie found this out. He was ordered, for example, to kick out his mother-in-law from her sick bed while she was staying at her house, solely because she was foreign-born. He was ordered to fire his Catholic housekeeper because she was Catholic. So when you're working on a book like this, it can get pretty dark and dire when you're dealing with all these characters who are just, you're rolling your eyes and wondering, what makes people operate? So I was happy to have the sports stories to return to occasionally. And one of the most cheerful ones, particularly if you were progressive in that era and you were looking for a reason to feel optimistic about, say, race relations, you could look no further than Joe Louis, the great boxer, who had been born in Alabama and grew up in Detroit and boxed at the Brewster Center, which still exists in dilapidated condition. Went pro in the summer of 1934, and within 2 years was filling Yankee Stadium. Joe Louis was, whether he was boxing or dating or visiting his mother, he was front page news in almost every issue of every major Negro newspaper in that era. And he had white people rooting for him too, not unanimously, but he did have white folks. My dad used to talk about how on fight night, when he was a teenager, and on a summer fight night, you could walk down the street and you didn't need a radio with you because the game would be broadcast from windows and doors. You could just hear it as you were walking down the street. And so this is young Joe Louis with Mickey Cochrane and young Joe Louis with the new car. Joe Louis was trained to be the opposite of Jack Johnson, who was an early African-American boxing champion, who was a very ballsy, in-your-face, taunting boxer, gold-toothed, dating young white women. When he beat one of the former white champions, he was over the top of them and, just rubbing it in, and it resulted in race riots across the country. And so Joe Louis's managers knew that the only way Joe Louis would ever get a heavyweight shot is if he were nothing like Jack Johnson. So Joe Louis had all sorts of rules he had to abide by, designed by his managers. Never be seen alone with a white woman. Be careful about who you're associating with. You don't want to be with folks who are associated with drugs or gambling. And so a lot of the publicity shots you see from that era are of Joe Louis with his mom after he buys her a home, Joe Louis reading his Bible at boxing camp. And he was a genuinely nice guy, and actually later in life spent a lot of time out in Utica because he was a horse guy. So you could look to Joe Louis maybe to lift your spirits, or you could look to this other guy, this junior from Ohio State University who comes into Ferry Field in Ann Arbor on May 25th, 1935. Somebody want to raise a hand if they know who this is? Okay, I'm going to go with the guy who raised the hand. So I heard the answer a lot of places. All right, here we go. So Jesse Owens, on that day in Ann Arbor, he performs what is still considered one of the greatest track performances of all time. Within 1 hour's time, he breaks 3 world records and ties a 4th. And he does this where he's not even 100%. And there are thousands of people, whites and blacks, in those stadium stands. One of them was the All-American center from the University of Michigan, Gerald Ford, thank you. Gerald Ford, who was so impacted by that, even though he was rooting for the guy's opponent, the U of M guy, that when he became president of the United States, he invited Jesse Owens into the White House to honor him. So you could look to these 2 black gentlemen, and both of them were gentlemen, Joe Louis And of course, Jesse Owens is going to become much more famous a year later during the 1936 Olympics when he shows up Hitler. But that very same night that this happens, about 15 miles away in Pinckney, the Black Legion has been planning a party. And the party is this. The local commander simply wants to have some fun. He wants to know, and this is his idea of fun, what it feels like to kill a black man. And so they've lured Silas Coleman, a World War I veteran, out to Pinckney. Dayton Dean and another guy drive them out to Rush Lake, park in front of the cottage. It's nighttime. Silas is told that they're out there to collect money that is owed him for contracting work he's done. And so he waits in the car. Dayton goes behind the house, tells the local colonel, Colonel Davis, I've got him in the car. And the colonel makes up a story for the other legionnaires who've been drinking all night and partying. And he says, we got this black, I'm sure he didn't use that word, this black guy in the car. He beat up a white boy. We're going to teach him a lesson. And so the caravan of cars takes Silas Coleman out to the Ford Mill Pond. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Pinckney. It's still there, but it was bigger back in the day. Silas begins to suspect something's up. You hear the sounds of nature. It's a moonlit night. He's told that the guy who owes him money is in a boat fishing at midnight in the pond. He makes a run for it, and they hunt him down, shoot him, and his body is found there the next day. I know there's a former Detroit police officer pre your time, so no offense intended, but the Detroit police in that era weren't terribly interested in investigating Silas Coleman's death. They attribute it to simply he must have done some other black people wrong. And that was pretty much the end of it until a year later when the Black Legion gets exposed. And it's the murder of Charles Poole, a Catholic in southwest Detroit, that leads to the undoing of the Black Legion in May 1936. The Legion had been founded in the 20s, kind of died out, and prospered again in the early 30s, partly due to Bert Effinger and some other recruiters, as well as the fact that in the heart of the Depression, when that unemployment rate is 40 to 45%, as we talked about, one way to secure a job was to be in the Black Legion. Because in addition to everything else the Legion stood for, it was anti-union. It's estimated that half of the departments at Ford's Rouge plant were controlled by the Black Legion, which the Rouge plant was controlled by Harry Bennett. He was head of the 1,000-member security force of spies and others. Anyway, Mr. Poole is, is just, his second daughter's just been born. He's a WPA worker, only has income coming in a couple days. He needs to find a job. So the local colonel of the Black Legion realized this, and he's setting a trap. Back in that day, the industrial leagues in Detroit, the baseball leagues, were very competitive. If you were a good ball player, you could potentially get a factory job if you were talented enough to play for the baseball team. He was a catcher like Mickey Cochrane, whom he idolized. And the local colonel came to his flat where he was painting, getting ready for the baby to come home, and told him, I've got a job for you at Temkin, which was a plant just down the street. If you play baseball for them, we're going to have a baseball meeting tonight where a bunch of us guys are going to go get measured for uniforms. We'll pick you up at one of the bars. And that's what Charlie knew of the story. There are two other parts to the story. One is the true part, was the colonel of this local regiment. His best friend had a crush on Charlie's wife, a Baptist girl, since they were both kids in Tennessee. They'd grown up with Becky Poole, and here she was married to some Catholic guy. That didn't sit well with him, and he'd like another shot at winning Becky's heart. So it was just the two, maybe three people who knew about that story. That evening, when the colonel met with the Black Legionnaires at Finletter Temple, he told them another story. And that story was, there's this Catholic guy, Charlie Poole. He beat the hell out of his wife. She's in the hospital. The baby died. what are we going to do? And of course, he riles the crowd, and the answer is, take them on a one-way ride, let's teach them a lesson, let's give them a beating. And so the caravan of cars, with Charlie thinking he's going to a baseball meeting, leaves southwest Detroit, crosses the Rouge River, and somewhere in Dearborn along Gully Road, he is shot and killed. The next morning when his body is discovered, police initially think he looks a little bit like one of the Purple Gang members. So they send his fingerprints off, and a match comes back, because back in the 20s, Charlie had, they sent fingerprints off to the FBI. A match comes back because he had jumped a train back in the 1920s in Kansas City. And the investigation has begun, and soon somebody cracks and breaks that vow of secrecy, and the Black Legion starts to unravel. And at first, before the local detectives had discovered their boss's membership card, there were calls for everybody to be exposed. And they first thought it was just the Democratic prosecutor who was a member. Everybody's going to be exposed. Well, when some of the officers discovered their boss's card, and that the beginning of a cover-up was starting to take place, they were able to finagle that knowledge into promotions and into jobs for their friends. And this is a time when the police force is not trained like it is today. Anyway, hysteria spreads. Women are learning that their husbands and their sons are members of this organization, and it's frightening because you don't know who was a member. Members start burning their outfits, dumping them in swamps, and it's such big news that it amazes me now. Usually when I do speaking engagements, I know I have a more history-oriented audience here, and I talked with a few of you, so I know some of you had heard of the Black Legion before this. Usually when I do speaking engagements, people think maybe I'm talking about the Purple Gang, which was, of course, the Jewish rum runners who did their crimes for profit. And very few people know of the Black Legion. And it's interesting to me how some of our history kind of dissipates and evaporates and isn't celebrated. I always hear Purple Gang stories. Oh, my uncle dealt with the Purple Gang. Oh, we got this hole in our restaurant wall was from the Purple Gang. I mean, there's stories. I live in New Baltimore, so it's not far from the St. Clair River and, running the rum across the river. But I don't hear many people talking about the Black Legion. But back in its day, it was a big deal, so much so that there were a couple movies that came out about the Black Legion, one starring a young Humphrey Bogart in this case. There were plays that were written, radio serials. The national commentators were writing columns about the Black Legion, editorial cartoonists all across the country. When the trials began, the big-name reporters were sent from New York and Washington and Chicago to cover the trial. I don't want to end on a dark note, so I'm going to end on a happy baseball story. Hope that's okay. We talked about 4 Tiger players, in detail, 4 Hall of Famers, Cochrane and the 3 G-men. This guy was by far the most popular guy on the team that 1934 season. He's a southern boy from Arkansas, spoke with a slow draw. He was about as tall as Hank Greenberg, 6'5". When the team would come into one of the 2 train stations that the Tigers used, and there were hundreds of fans waiting, you would always see his head bobbing above the crowd and people calling his name. And in that 1934 season, he was sitting on top of the world, as you can see. He won 13 straight games, 14 straight games, 15 straight games without a loss, 16 straight games, tying the American League record. Doesn't break who said it? It was Schoolboy. Okay. I'm going to try the throw, should I? All right, good job. Doesn't break the record, but ties the American League record. 2 days after, he appears on one of the most popular radio shows in the nation, the Rudy Valley Hour. And they've scripted a line for him, a version of which is going to get messed up, but follow him until his dying day. And so he goes on there in his sweet drawl. He says, "Hello, Ma. Hello, Edna. How am I doing?" And for the rest of his career, whenever he steps on a field, people are yelling, "How's Edna? How's your sweetie? How's Edna doing?" When he gives up home runs, the hecklers on the other bench are yelling, "How the hell does Edna think you're doing now?" That kind of thing. And this is Edna. They both became huge celebrities, as everybody on the Tigers did that year, but these two in particular. Bars had drinks in their name. Restaurants had special dishes named for Edna and Schooley. William Randolph Hearst's Detroit Times hired Edna to be a front page columnist. And when I was working on this book, and I'm going to close with this, all of the main folks featured in here are dead and have been dead for a while. And so you go for primary sources, some of which I mentioned, but you still want to talk to people. I tried to reach out to every Effinger who lives in Lima, and there are dozens of them. I tried to befriend them on Facebook and, Twitter follow them and send them letters, make phone calls. Not one responded. Nobody wants to be associated with the leader of a hate group that murdered people, even if he never did go to jail. But family members of victims and family members of the sports stars were more than willing to talk. And so it was fun to talk with Schoolboy Rowe's grandsons, who are about my age. Schooley had died in the early 60s, I believe, when he was 50, 51 years old, young man, relatively speaking. And Edna lived on for several decades more. And when Edna died, they inherited all sorts of stuff. And they started telling me about this sweet little wooden box that they came where she must have kept her real treasures. And in it contained all these lovely little notes, love notes that were signed by Linwood, which was his real name, to my dear Edna, I love you always, Linwood. And among that were all these other trinkets. Now they know the story as well, but it was fun to hear them describe the trinkets that were in this little box, because Schoolboy Rowe was an incredibly superstitious man, especially when he had that win streak going. And he had gotten into the habit of massaging little items that he had collected as if they were rosary beads before every pitching performance. And so here they start describing things, and it's the green jade elephant that I know he was massaging back then, and not only a rabbit's foot, but some coin from the Netherlands, a piece of glass he picked off the street in Chicago, another coin from Toronto. And it was just kind of fun to be able to fill them in on it. I'm going to stop there because I don't want you to feel trapped. I'm happy to answer any of your questions, and I don't have any more candy bars to give. Normally I ask 2 other questions, but anybody know who the mayor, the last name of the mayor and one of the U.S. senators, father and son, and they have a road named after them in Detroit? That's right, Cousins, great. And the other I usually ask is, the Lions won that national title in 1935. Do you know what field they played on? Briggs. Not Briggs, no. U of V, University of Detroit used to have a football stadium. So, any questions? Yes.
Well, I'm one of those people that knows nothing of the Black Legion. So, but you did hint. No one ever went to jail?
Oh, no. People went to jail. Dozens of people went to jail, primarily for the murders of Silas Coleman and Charlie Poole. And it was mostly as a result of one member speaking out and starting to entangle others. So there were grand juries. The grand jury in Oakland County, I think, was the most honest and public of their results of their investigation. They actually issued lists of about 200 people who were affiliated, including state rep, including Pontiac officials, fire department folks. The Detroit, the Wayne County one I'm highly suspicious of. It was controlled by a single judge who implicated nobody other than the people who were outed by the one Legionnaire who talked. And Bert Effinger went underground in Ohio, protected by police authorities there, because they controlled the Legion in the area where he was from. He could not be extradited until 2 years after everybody else's trials, and by that point, the people who were supposed to testify him had either disappeared or weren't willing to testify any longer. The bottom line is he probably just knew too much in terms of higher-ups who were involved. One of the really kind of heartbreaking things I came upon as a researcher was an interview that a historian scholar had done back in 1979 with one of the last living detectives who had investigated, who had been a key part of the investigation. And he had agreed never to release this interview while both of them were alive. So I got to release the information, but it was kind of disappointing, and I'm sure it was disappointing for the historian when the police officer said, oh yeah, there were lots of famous people who were involved in the Legion. And he said, to protect ourselves, we officers kept lists of, and I had like more than 1,500 names on the list of like business owners and local celebrities and stuff. It's not to say that they were all out there shooting and killing people, not to say that at all, but the really killer part of the thing was he says, I wish you had approached me last year. I just threw that list away. So my suspicion, and I hesitate to even mention it because I can't prove it, is that Mickey Cochrane, being very good friends with Harry Bennett, may have been tricked into joining the Black Legion just as a businessman. You were required to obtain a handgun before your membership. We have records of Harry Bennett signing for his handgun in the Detroit offices. And at that moment when the Black Legion is exposed and everybody's saying everybody who's affiliated is going to be exposed, Mickey Cochrane has a nervous breakdown, and Harry Bennett flies him out mid-baseball season to recover in Wyoming for a month. I don't know. It's all flimsy and circumstantial, and just a gut.
So I was wondering, what other activities did they do? I mean, just big, high-profile ones you mentioned, but constantly, or
Oh yeah,
were a lot of them involved, or was there a lot of them just they had to join, but they didn't?
yeah. That's one of the challenges to figure out who was really into it and who wasn't. Because by the end, Dayton Dean was saying, he figured he was just being used as a tool by other people, because the way he sold it was, if I didn't do what they wanted me to do, they were sending other guys with me who were supposed to then kill me if I didn't do my assignment. And so it's difficult to ferret out who was really into it. We only know a lot about 2 regiments because, 3 regiments. The Jackson State Prison was controlled by the Legion, the guards that worked there. It was a very strong regiment there. But we only know about the ones where the guys spoke, where they broke the vow of secrecy. Otherwise, other people held to that secret, and a lot of murders went unsolved. Sometimes they were bodies with a gun next to them. A lot of their victims actually were members of the organization, or reluctant members who were being punished by the organization. Others were union activists, and there would be, in those cases, there would be a union application tucked under their bodies, which was a signal, according to Maurice Sugar, that this, to the police department, that this was just labor violence and not to bother investigating. But they did a lot of bombings of bookstores, of meeting places, of workers' camps, of communist newspaper offices. They bombed, when there was a very volatile strike on the east side of Detroit, they bombed several houses over that way. There were a lot of disruption of meetings. There were a lot of failed attempts to do things. There were car chases through the city in one case. a lot of unsolved murders. And so it's difficult to track down. If there's a hero in the book, I think it's the state police captain, Ira Marmon, who kept pushing, even years after the court cases, kept trying to get the FBI interested in investigating. And finally he was retired. But there were definitely honest cops who were pushing it, but you run up against some powerful figures. So they involved themselves in a lot of things. But
Were they connected to the Klan at all?
a lot of them were former Klan members. Actually, when they were exposed, everybody was being asked their viewpoint by different reporters, and somebody asked the Grand Wizard of the Klan, and he said, "Punish them to the full extent of the law. We don't believe in this sort of stuff." So there was a rivalry that existed. The guy who had started the Black Legion in Baer, Ohio, was a disgruntled Klan member who, a lot of Klan members felt that the Klan took advantage of them, that people were higher-ups were getting rich off of the dues that they had to pay for their uniforms. I don't even know if that's the right word, uniform. But, costume. But he also didn't think the Klan was exciting enough. He wanted a more adventuresome Klan. So it was a rivalry. Yeah.
You mentioned Ohio and the Detroit area. Was it more widespread than?
It was primarily, the bulk of it was Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, with a little bit in Kentucky, a little bit in Illinois. And and once it broke loose, then police were inundated with people all over the country claiming stuff that was Black Legion related. In fact, there's a famous, I'm going to show my lack of literary knowledge here. Was it Richard Wright who wrote the book about Bigger Thomas? I can't remember the name, about an African-American criminal, which was based on a true case. So there was actually a black guy in Chicago who murdered a nurse, I think it was, while her young child was in the bed, and he scrawled on the mirror, "Black Legion did it." And there were a variety of death threats that would be issued in other parts of the country, but for the most part, most of the big meetings and powerful regiments were in those three states. Malcolm X's mother believed that her husband was murdered by the Black Legion. Malcolm X had mixed views on whether that was true or not. There were a lot of factory towns where the Legion was powerful. Toledo had a lot of stuff that was never investigated, though. Yeah.
The philosophy with the hate and the targeting of certain individuals, it sounds very similar to what was going on in Germany at the same time. Were there any ties to links to Nazism?
Yeah, none that I could find. I think they would have said that they were against Nazism. I think, it was a lot of the against foreign folks, and then the old, Klan criticism of Catholics is that what power do they answer to, our nation or the Pope,
Probably half of them were second-generation Americans anyway, in terms of foreign being.
Some of them, others, possibly. There are a lot of, immigrants who were living here at that time too, though. So. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Harry Bennett, didn't he start having lose power as a result of this investigation?
A little bit later on. So he, in the early 40s, Edsel dies before Henry. And I'm not a labor expert, but Edsel dies first, and he was supposed to be the one who was going to take over for Henry. Henry in the 30s he's absolutely interested in his automobile company, but really his passion is in Greenfield Village. He's building up Greenfield Village at that point, acquiring things. And so, Edsel had been anointed as the guy, even though there were other power centers in Ford. And then when Edsel died, that's when the real power struggle began, and it was between several people there. And then finally, the Ford family united with the grandson, Henry II, backed by an FBI agent, I believe, who helped bring down Harry Bennett. And I was looking for Harry Bennett's records, but when Harry Bennett realized he was going out, they were being destroyed, according to the guy at the Benson Ford Library at Henry Ford. They were destroying the records very rapidly. So there's very little of Harry Bennett's records, what he did, who he was affiliated with. He was on the parole board for the state of Michigan, and they used to parole ex-convicts into his care, and he gave them jobs as part of the service department, including people who had been there for manslaughter and murder. And he had ties. He claimed that they were to protect Henry's grandkids, but he had associations with Detroit's organized crime families, as a way, he said, of making sure Henry's children weren't abducted. And then Harry loses power, I think it's like 1945, 44, somewhere in there. I'm not precise on that. And he just kind of disappears. He has a congressional hearing in the 50s that he has to, I believe it is. And he becomes a painter out in California and dies in the 70s. I think he'd make a fascinating book. I'm just not sure I can find enough material on him. And there were, as I mentioned, there were people who loved him. Because you have to, you take all this in the context of the times, and I really will stop after this. You take it in the context of the times of the heart of the Depression. People are hurting in a severe way, and they're open to other forms of government. And the revolution in Russia was not that long prior. And so there are people in America legitimately concerned from their perspective that these people who may be organizing the unions or maybe have grander ambitions to overthrow the government, to make us a socialist or a communist nation. And so, I've done speaking engagements where there were people who were very much in Harry Bennett's corner of this. And also met a couple of Father Coughlin's friends as well. So he was very nice over Sunday dinner, they said.
I had a question about that movie. I haven't seen it. Is it any good?
Well, good is all kind of relative. It got out there really quickly, like within 1 year of all this. It was like ripped from the headlines TV movie, only not TV, obviously. It's based loosely on the Black Legion. Humphrey Bogart's character doesn't get the promotion. It goes to a foreign-born German guy who's kind of has an engineer's intellect, and he gets swept up into the Black Legion thing. Tries to get out, but as he says, there's.
Is it filmed in Detroit?
Oh, well, you can still see it occasionally on AMC, and it's actually out there on DVD. I've never seen the other one, though the Detroit Library may have it. Yeah, it's so. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I appreciate it.